Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Chris Little with Why We Lead, and I'm here with the man, the myth, the legend, Steve Leonard with the Doctrine Man. I really appreciate you being on today. Why don't you go
Really glad
ahead
to
and
be here,
just
Chris.
tell us a little bit about yourself, your time in the Army, post-Army, and what it is you're doing now.
So this is always the most fun part. This is when I have to admit my age. So like I'm a Reagan era commissionee, which really it means I pinned my gold bar on during the heyday of the Cold War. So that really kind of puts things in perspective. I don't know that many people who were around when Reagan was president, but yeah, I commissioned when Reagan was still in office, and it was a fun thing to remember as the year went by. I was a double major in engineering, civil and mechanical engineering, and all I ever wanted to be in life was an engineer. And of course, it was the Army, so in its infinite wisdom, it made me a maintenance officer instead. And the story behind that is I always told people I was an ROTC guy. I went to the University of Idaho, and I get the call from the PMS, hey, you need to come on up. We're gonna, all the commissioning stuff is in. You've been assessed. And I go up to his office and he says, hey, this is great. You're regular Army. Everything's wonderful. And he said, and you got the Ordnance Corps. And I had no idea what it was, because when we did our branch selection, it wasn't on my list. It wasn't something I looked at. And I said, God, sir, what is that? And he said, those are the guys that fix typewriters. And from day one, all I thought was, I got to get out of here. I'm not going to be that guy. Well, it was, as you probably know yourself, the maintenance world was a lot different than what I expected. And so I dove in, head first and tried to be the best I could at what I was doing. It wasn't always the most glorious job in the world, but I learned a lot, and it gave me a ton of good material to write on and to cartoon about. By the time I was a senior major, my career had started to take a different track.
Mm-hmm.
I was working a job where I had regular access to senior Army leaders. I really liked it. So I switched over to become a strategist, which kind of better suited to where I was at and what I wanted to do. And I thought for me, that was a really ideal situation, because I'd taken the time, probably about 12, 13 years, to really build a strong tactical foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And then to be able to build on top of that, I felt really confident that I knew enough about the tactics to work strategy and understand how strategy played out at the lowest levels.
Mm-hmm.
And that worked well for me. Anyway, so I spent the rest of my career bouncing around 3- and 4-star headquarters, hung it all up in 2015, which seems like, it's hard to believe it's been 5 years. But at the 28-year mark,
Wow.
and went to pursue my second career, which was in higher ed.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll like this, it was perfect. I stepped out of the Army on one day, 5 days later into higher education, where I'm doing kind of the exact same things I did in the Army. My focus is absolutely on developing the next generation. And I've been able to take everything I learned over 28 years, take it into a classroom and deliver it to a new audience. And then just bring that knowledge, that experience to bear in the classroom, which is, you can't beat that, and you get paid for it too. So
Yeah, that is
it was
awesome.
an interesting transition. Once I got used to it, it was okay. The first year was a little odd. We have a language of our own, and I've written about that we have this unique language of our own. And for the first year or so, I tried not to use that language, not to say things to people, not, hey, it's time to leave, let's pull chocks, and have nobody know what I was talking about. I gave up after a year, and just, you either understand me or you don't understand me. I'm not going to change who I am at this point. And the people I work with, they laugh at me sometimes. They make faces. They don't understand what I mean when I say something specific. And okay, let us walk through this. And there's the long pole in the tent is a tent that goes in the middle, or whatever. So it's been a great transition. Like I said, 5 years into it, and it's gone really quickly, and it's been a lot of fun.
Well, yeah, you've been doing a lot. I mean, keeping up with the website, doing that, just mentoring the new generation. It's been a lot of stuff. I wanted to touch on a quick point you were talking about a minute ago, you went from the tactical to the operational level. How big of from a leadership perspective standpoint was that for you?
It was interesting because the transition wasn't that tough. I had worked at the tactical level for years. I'd gone to the School of Advanced Military Studies, which focuses on operational art. Mm-hmm. And I was leading the team that was putting together the Army's capstone operational level doctrine. And so we were already making the translation of things at the tactical level into the operational level. So becoming a strategist really wasn't a huge leap. It was just that next level up. I'd already read everything that you read. I'd already been through the education. So it wasn't a huge difference, but I thought it was important. And it's something that when I mentored other strategists or coached other strategists, that I always would tell people, wait until you really understand the tactical level before you make the leap. Because it's kind of like, if you decide to build a house and you just buy some blueprints, but you've never picked up a hammer or a saw in your life, you're just not going to be able to do it. You need to understand how things work and why they work the way they do, and understand the integration of capabilities and how do you synchronize fires across domains. You need to know all that stuff before you start to think about it in much bigger terms, because it doesn't come together if you don't understand it.
That's interesting. Did you have I'm assuming you had a team under you when you did that, or?
Oh yeah, there was a funny thing. I was the third chief of the area that put this together. So the third person to lead the team. Took us about 4 or 5 years to do. And there were about 6 of us on the team, core of people that were all SAMS graduates, that the Army believed, the Chief Staff of the Army put the team together, believing that that's what you needed to get all the language right, to get the concepts all plugged in together, and that kind of thing.
Awesome. So with concepts and strategy and everything, how much do you think, I know you're an avid reader. I see the bookshelf behind you. We've talked before. How much do you think you reading prior to that helped prepare you for that position? And what are you currently reading?
Oh, yeah, that's okay. So let me answer the first question last.
Okay.
And that's that when it really comes to reading, the more we read, the better prepared we are. I used to use the description of a professor I had in college, whose name I've long since forgotten, who taught us. He walked in on the first day and he started to write books, names of books, up on a chalkboard. Went through about 3 chalkboards, wrote all these different books down, then wrote some authors down, and said, if you want to be a better writer, if you want to be a better thinker, this is where you start. And it was all classic literature, everything from Shakespeare to Asimov. You pick and choose. And his point being is that you can never read enough. And the more you read, the more literate you become. And he would tell us that, your mind is like a library. The more you put into them, the deeper the knowledge becomes, the higher the quality of author, the better of a writer you become. And, it's all about learning. And he was the first person I ever heard who quoted Kennedy that leading and learning were inseparable. And I didn't follow any of that kind of stuff as a college student. That wasn't my thing. I read for fun, but I didn't read to learn. And he turned everything upside down for us, and then he taught us, at least those who paid attention in class, the concept of what it meant to be a lifelong learner. And that it all began with reading. And the more you read, the more you learned, the smarter you got. And it was just a matter of then picking the right things to read, which then gets me to your second question. That's a tough one because I'm usually reading about 5 books at once. I'll read until I get bored with one, skip, go to another. So literally, I'm reading a book right now called Operation Paperclip, which is about the program to bring Nazi scientists to the United States after World War II. It's a great read. It's also the kind of read that makes you scratch your head and wonder, did some of these people weren't scientists. Some of these people we probably didn't need to bring here at all, but we did anyway. I've been reading Locked on Teams by a guy named Bill Duke. That's for a future class. I've got a whole stack of team building, leadership and team building books that I'm looking at for a class that I'm going to teach in the spring.
Awesome.
On team building, and I'm taking over and redesigning the class along a certain model that I use. Mm-hmm. So that's up. And a guy named Brian Mickelson sent me a book called Warbot 1.0, which I am in the early stages of the book, but it's just a good science fiction book about the future that's interesting. And I also just finished a Star Trek graphic novel on the history of Khan, which is really relevant because the project I mentioned earlier, mm-hmm. That's a central piece of it. It's what we're doing is we've got a contract with Casemate Books in the UK to put together an anthology of chapters that deal with different aspects of leadership using classic science fiction as a metaphor to teach the lesson. And of course, Khan is a great example of experience over intelligence that's brought up routinely through the Wrath of Khan. Mm-hmm. Kirk's experience versus Khan's intelligence. And so we've got like several different bins that we're looking at. We've got a team of about 35 writers that are all contributing, and we're aiming for Christmas 2021 for publication.
That is awesome.
Yeah,
I look forward to reading it whenever it comes out.
I swore I wouldn't do another one of these after Why We Write. Yeah. And it was funny. General Mick Ryan from Australia, uh-huh. He cornered me and said, "We need to do this." And I can't say no to a great idea. And it was a fantastic idea. And so the first thing I do is, yeah, let's do this. And so, we're right in the middle of doing it. So
that's awesome. Stuff. Well, I'm sure your whole audience can't wait to read it. Yeah. Speaking of reading, that's a pretty eclectic list. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. I bring up reading so much because I know for at least like the CGO perspective, a lot of people get burnt out with the work-life balance. And typically, at least on the officer side, they're trying to take masters, which fortunately I just finished mine. But having to read on top of that, I found personally audiobooks help me a lot because I have a 30 to 45 minute drive to work, depending on if I'm going to or from. And that's helped me just churn through books. And because when I get home, it's full up kid time because my kids are 3 and 6. So very much.
So I had the same commute up until we went into quarantine.
Okay.
And so when I taught at Fort Leavenworth, which is about 45 minutes from here. Mm-hmm. And that gave me time to start to churn through books. I was really enjoying it, and then it ended. And honestly, I can't listen to books when I'm in the gym, and it distracts me. I end up just sitting there listening and not paying attention. I can sit and drive, but I can't sit and write. I can't sit and work. I can't sit and do anything else. And so I put my audiobook subscription on hold for now until I get back to the commuting again.
Yeah, it's definitely easier to do it while driving. I'll try and do it while running or something as opposed to music, and I kind of just get lost in thought half the time. So along with reading, obviously we've already kind of touched on writing a little bit. Why is it important for a leader to write and be able to articulate their thoughts from your perspective?
So that's just an interesting topic because I gotta go back to why I write, which mm-hmm. is it kind of sets the stage for this. And it's part of the chapter in Why We Write that I opened with. And it sets the stage for everything else. And so you take Steve Leonard, about 1985, 86 time frame. I'm a junior in college. I probably never written more than a paragraph or two in my entire life. I don't write. I read a lot, but I don't write. My focus is being an engineer. And so my junior year rolls around, and there was a required class called Tech Writing for Engineers. And it was the obligatory, I hate myself, I had to write like 2-3 page papers which was, they were actually longer than that, but that was what it was. Get the engineers out, teach them how to write. So they write, and we still do this even today. We have, tech writing for business, whatever, that get people that are in professional schools to actually learn how to do something that involves literacy. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so you dial yourself back. One of my professors was a lady named Margaret von Braun, whose dad, a lot of people know who he is, the father of the U.S. space program, Werner von Braun. So as a result of her classes, I had this absolute fascination with missile design and missiles in general. And so I get into this class, and so my first assignment, I write this 10-page paper on the technical shortfalls of Soviet nuclear missile design. So really exciting stuff, right?
Oh yeah.
But I mean, it was a fun read, or a fun write, and I had a good time with it. And the professor, this guy named Skip Stratton, he calls me into his office the next day. And here's how it worked back then. You turn in your paper, you drop a cassette tape in this envelope, and then you turn this stuff in. When he was done, you'd get the cassette tape back. So I go back, and I was working as a firefighter. I plug my cassette in the deck at the fire station, and all it says is, "Come see me." That can't be good, right? So I go see him, and he just looks at me and says, he's giving me the riot act on, honor code, plagiarism, I can throw you out of this class kind of stuff. And he said, and I'm like, where would I plagiarize this stuff? There's nowhere. And he said, well, you're either a plagiarist or you're the best writer that I've had come through this program in 25 years, which I took as a huge compliment, aside from the backhanded compliment of sorts. So he takes me under his wing, and he says, look, you got to write more. You're in the wrong field. First of all, you shouldn't be an engineer. You should be a writer. But I'm already in my second semester of my junior year. So I'm beyond turning back now. So when I finally got around to graduating, he hands me a challenge. He says, look, what you need to do is you need to write for publication. Publish one article every year the rest of your life. No matter what you do, publish one article a year. And to put that in context, I graduated from college in 1987. Mm-hmm. No internet to speak of, no websites, no web publishing. It's magazine, right? American Heritage, Newsweek. It's magazines, right? Mm-hmm. So what are you going to do? So I start to write, and I swore I wasn't going to let him down. I was going to fulfill that challenge. And so I wrote, and I had stacks of rejection letters. Just, no, this is what we're looking for. No. But I kept trying, and I kept trying. I occasionally, I would slip an article into a military publication, which, those were a little easier to get into. But in the end, it finally kicked. And so by the early to mid 90s, I was 2-3 articles a year. I was selling some stuff. I was really excited about it. I mean, I was actually doing some freelancing. It was all coming together. But that's how I started writing. And in the process, what I found out was professionally, that started to be the thing that got me the next job. And so, I'm a senior company grade, and I'm getting ready to change command and go back to the United States. I get a visit from a 1-star who says, hey, I want you to be my speechwriter. I want you to write this for me. I want you to do. And then the job started to come, schooling, Sam's. When I applied to Sam's, the only thing anybody cared about was, oh, you've got this publishing portfolio. Let's talk about what you've written, what's right, what's wrong, what we like, what we don't like. But we had this really good conversation. And I started to become that guy who, oh, he can write, so let's bring him in. Let's have you write this. Let's have you do the writing for this. And so, you look back in 1986 when I'm the guy who's never written more than 2 paragraphs. All of a sudden, 15 years later, I'm the go-to guy as a writer. I still, and I joke about this, I still don't know the difference between a dangling participle and an adverb on any given day, because I never paid attention in English class. but I know how to put the right words in the right place in the right sequence and not make grammatical errors. And I don't know how I know that, but I do. And you know, I'm thankful. I'm thankful for that. And anyway, so then what I tell other people is, you know, that there's a good reason professionally to write, because it makes you a better leader, because you're able to more clearly communicate. And when I teach, that's something I stress. You're going to write, you're going to write, you're going to write, because if you can write clearly, then you can communicate clearly. And if you can't write clearly, you have limited utility. You can only hide it for so long. So let's focusing on your writing and think in terms of how you lead through the written word as well, and how you articulate yourself. And the other part of it became storytelling. You know, how do you cement your legacy? Because that's what Skip Stratton had told me. Is like, you know, let's face it. He said, we're pretty boring people. So, you know, I'm not going to win the Medal of Honor. You know, you may get a Distinguished Flying Cross. I don't know. But you need, you know, what's your legacy going to be? And he said, here's an opportunity to craft your own legacy. Not only do you get it right, but you can create your own legacy and then leave it behind, because those words will live beyond your time. You know, that's a brilliant way to think about it. And so, I mean, who wants to leave this world and be forgotten?
Yeah,
You know,
it's a
you don't
tough
think
pill to
about it, but
swallow.
I'd like to think that you actually had some influence, that you made some kind of difference. And writing is a way to be that difference maker, to get your ideas out there, to help shape discussion on things, and to help grow a better generation, or the next generation of leaders behind you, and teach them to do the same thing. And over time, I've come to look at this in terms of that we all have stories. So it's just a matter of whether or not we tell them, and then taking those stories, like I'd mentioned in our earlier conversation, about taking those stories, attaching the lesson to the stories, weaving that in there, and then being able to tell that story. So this week, for example, I wrote a piece for Clearance Jobs, which was literally, I think it probably took me 15 minutes to write, and it was about how you disagree with your boss.
That
And
was a good
literally
one.
all I did was start with a story of a guy that disagreed with my boss and pissed him off to the point that we had to chase the guy out of the building. But there was a way to disagree, and it's a problem that we all have. We're all in a situation someday where we want to disagree, but we're not sure how to disagree. So how can you do that? So here, let me tell you the story of the guy who couldn't disagree, and challenge, you know, the major who challenged a 3-star general to a debate, and we had to throw him out. And then what could he have done?
Mm-hmm.
And so you get the story, you get the moral of the story, and hey, you know, there are ways to do things, and people can read something like that and go, yeah, you know, that makes sense. You know, I maybe I can disagree with the boss, or, you know, maybe there's a better way to do things. And it really just starts with a story. I did a conference a couple years ago where I was talking to some logistics folks, and we ended up talking about property accountability. And I told them the story of a CGO commander who had taken command of an organization and had found all these excess tools that he couldn't find anybody signed for. And so we're off in Desert Storm. He takes all these tools, puts them in a 40-foot mill van, and buries the mill van in the middle of the desert, because he knows this stuff is all excess. And, you know, but it wasn't. And so 6 months later, we're back in the States, and people say, hey, wait, where's this stuff? It's buried in Saudi Arabia. And it was to the tune of about $375,000. And so as we're talking about property accountability and doing inventories correctly, I'm casting the story out there. The guy who did the quick inventories, trusted that everything was right, found a bunch of crap he didn't know where it belonged. Instead of doing the right thing and turning it in, buried it in the desert, covered it in battery acid. And then when the investigation was all over, he had to pay the whole amount.
Wow.
Because it was purposeful. he knew what he was doing. There was no, oops, I lost, a couple of wrenches. It was, yeah, I buried $375,000 worth of equipment in the Saudi desert.
Yeah, that's the character kind of goes a
Well,
long way with
I
that one.
guess that means you're going to have no pay due for a long time. Well, that
Uh,
gets to the whole. So that's where I get to where people. Um, there's a story out there to tell. Everybody has a story. It's just learning to tell that story and learning to weave the lesson into it.
so I wanted to talk about 2 points that you had there. One was you had this mentor going through college that kind of poked you and prodded you to get out of your comfort zone of first writing because you hadn't really ever wrote before. And then he helped kind of vector you, giving you a challenge like, hey, I want you to write 1 year for the rest of your life. Do you think that you would be the writer today had you have not had a mentor to help kind of push you along the way?
Absolutely not. I would not have. I never gave writing a second thought before I took that class. It was not on my radar. I was absolutely focused somewhere else. Writing just wasn't something that I did. And I watched my dad. My dad would try to write, but he was, here's my dad. He's 50 some years old at that point. I'm going to write an article. And then he would sit down for days at a time and it just wouldn't come because he waited until that point in his life to actually try to write anything. I would have been that guy too. I wouldn't have written, and God knows where my career would have gone had I not had that challenge early on in life.
Yeah, and I found it. People that have mentors typically are more successful overall. One, because they're held accountable for all intents and purposes, and then also it kind of helps vector their goals, in which one mind might not be able to do, and then you get another mind in there, and it's like, well, yeah, maybe I could do that, and kind of the same for you. And I got into writing a little bit differently, and mine's obviously a very young journey myself, but and quite frankly, if it wasn't for you and Josh Powers with Field Grade Leader, I might just be writing the college papers that I had been, not enjoying it a whole lot. And then I've always kind of had a knack for it. I never knew really how to go about it. And then one day Josh was like, hey, we're having this initiative for writing. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, I'll try that out. It's kind of the same like your dad. I was sitting there for a little bit, just kind of thinking on it, stewing on it. And just I think a lot of people struggle with just the getting there portion. It's kind of like going out for a run. Like you dread it, and then you actually get out there for the run, and then it's kind of easy once you start. So getting that momentum going, and now it takes me maybe not even a day to write one. And it's funny how the wheel just kind of starts churning, and you're like, man, I kind of enjoy that,
Yeah, I call that stream of consciousness writing, where people will say, what's your process? And I'll say, well, 1 day a week, I will sit down, I'll comb through my list of ideas, because I probably have 50 or 75 things. What's hot in my mind? Boom, I sit down and I write it from beginning to end in a few hours.
Mm-hmm.
Usually less than half a day if I can swing it. And that's just, that kind of writing actually comes really easily. It's a lot easier than doing academic writing or like long form writing.
Oh yeah, because you're interested in it and you're a little bit more invested in it. For me, I write like the first paragraph the day or night before, and then I come and just hack at it the next day, and it has worked pretty much every time since. So
I mow the lawn, and that's my thing. So like, I would tell my wife, I will go out and mow the lawn, and I will talk out the article while I'm mowing the lawn. I got like an acre of grass, and I do it with a push mower. And so I will push the lawnmower around, and
you're out there for hours.
Come in, boom. When I'm done mowing the lawn, I am ready to write.
That is awesome.
I know what I'm going to say.
Yeah, and quite frankly, the reason having the website's kind of like or at least I'm not going to speak for you, but I want to get other people to kind of write more and get out of their comfort zone, because I know it's helped me a lot, and I know that you've helped a lot of people along the way as well. So, do you think, and I don't want to get really controversial here or anything, but do you think it's a double-edged sword for people, particularly on active duty, to write? Like, I know there's a fine balance of, it's like anything on social media. You don't get political, like, kind of, do you think it's best to stay in the middle?
this is a funny thing because this is actually something that I hear from a lot of people.
Mhm.
I'm afraid to write. I'm afraid I'm going to be retaliated against for writing something. There's going to be payback at the end of this. And so people will ask me, like you said, is there a double-edged sword? And what I tell people is it just depends, um, because it
That's
depends
the
on what
pilot
you're going to
answer.
write and how you're going to write it. So no matter what you write, there's always going to be people who disagree with you. I wrote a fiction piece for the Atlantic Council like 4 years ago. I got hate mail from some guy. And that's not how VR goggles will work in 2040. And I mean, it was obscene. And I'm reading this thing going, really? I mean, I don't know what VR goggles are going to look like in 2040, nor do I care. It's just, I've envisioned like a heads up display. No, 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 it's all going to be on your wrist. Like, okay, look, so look, it goes to the fact that no matter what you write, somebody's going to disagree. Um, and there's always going to be people who are envious of you for good or bad. And it's the ones that are envious of you for the bad that you're going to remember the most because they're just going to hate you just for the fact that you're out there writing. Oh, Chris Little was that. He's out there writing. He doesn't know anything. He's never been a wing commander. He doesn't know what he's doing. You know what I mean?
Oh
And so
yeah. Oh yeah.
you're going to get some of that. But where the double-edged sword comes into play, there's two ways. One is if you're writing about something that you don't know anything about, you have absolutely no experience on. And I tell people, stick to what you know.
Mhm.
That's the first thing. If you don't want to find yourself on the wrong end of the law, stick to what you know. If you're a company grade officer and you're talking about what it's like to, command Space Force, you're probably not going to carry a lot of credibility. But there are people who feel obligated to write about stuff they don't know about. I don't know why they do it. I advise against it. And the other part that gets people into trouble is when they critique someone or something, and that's when you start to walk on eggshells. There's nothing wrong with offering criticism if what I like to say is you make sure your writing is well informed and everything that you write is based in facts and you keep emotion out of the equation. That's a big thing. If you feel emotional, you might not want to write about it.
Exactly.
But if you can't make a solid evidence-based case, then what it becomes is an opinion piece. And if your opinions aren't well informed by recognized facts, then you'll find yourself really quickly on the wrong edge of that sword. It's the way it happens. You're still going to make people upset no matter what. But if you want to write a critique, if you want to say, okay, the purchase of the F-35 was a horrible decision on the Air Force, well, then just make sure you have your facts in line, and that you have a good, strong, fact-based case, and that you're not just saying, well, it's too expensive. It'll never not have problems, because once you decide you're going to slaughter that sacred cow, you better have your proverbial ducks in a row, because
Yeah.
you're going to slaughter my cow. You better know what you're going to talk about, and you better know what you're talking about before you do so. And I think that's probably the biggest piece. You can write a critique. Now, you still might get some general somewhere who says, "Hey, I want to string you up off a flagpole for writing, that the curriculum in Maxwell Air Force Base is at the second grade level." But if you do it, just make sure you do it. You do it factually and a sound argument, just like you would anything else. But if you don't have those things, I tell people don't write. Don't write unless you've got everything set. If you have a full deck of cards and you know what you're going to say and you've got the facts behind you, then you can do it. If not, be careful.
That's some darn good advice, particularly with write about what you know, not what you're trying. Like, yeah, you can study something, but like for me, I wrote an article about reflections on flight command, which is, I would argue, a lot different than a company grade commander for you. But it was still a leadership position, and obviously my website's kind of devoted to leadership. So I just kind of wanted to stick to that topic because it's kind of what I know, at least at the tactical level, not necessarily the operational. I'm not trying to write on a wing commander's behalf or anything, because that's a whole different style of leadership.
But there are people who will. There are people who will, and they'll think, I mean, I see stuff. Now, granted, you see the same things I do. You can float along on Twitter, and you can see a lot of people who have grand opinions that are not based on fact or experience. You know, I just, hey, more power to you, but, you know, there's probably a good reason that those people have anonymous accounts. So I'll just leave it at that.
All right. I still want to talk about writing for 1 second, but in a different capacity. So obviously, you being a field grade leader before you got out, how important is it for a leader to be able to write, particularly, I don't know what the Army's exactly is called, but ours is officer performance reports or enlisted performance reports. How can you be a leader in the military if you are an ineffective writer? And I say that because a lot of people do not care. They brush it off.
No, they don't. You're right.
And it's particularly for me as a leader that's in charge of people. When I see that, I'm like, you need to write. And how did you get people to kind of get a little bit more invested in that?
If you've ever had an evaluation from somebody who can't write, then that's where it really stings, and it's almost insulting to get one of those, because then you feel like just saying, hey, look, if you can't write, just give it to me and I'll write the thing. I don't want to write my own evaluation, but I don't want somebody to write it who writes at an elementary school level. And there are officers that can't write any better than that, and they embarrass themselves and they hurt other people in the process. If you don't know how to write, that evaluation goes up in front of a board. I know boards probably don't spend that much time looking at them, but it's just the idea that if somebody can't convey succinctly how good you are and what your potential is, a board's going to eventually notice that. It's like, but wow, is that a reflection on you? Is it a reflection on them? I think, and I stress this: the ability to clearly communicate is essential to leadership. And I take it back one step further: is that, you know, as a leader, your job, your fundamental responsibility, at least in the way the Army looks at it, is to provide purpose, direction, and motivation. So it's the direction and the purpose piece that usually have to be written out. And if you can't clearly convey what it is that you want done and why you want it done, then you've already failed as a leader. Because I'll guarantee you that people who follow you, if they can't make sense of what you want done and why you want it done, they're going to screw it up. And they're going to constantly screw it up everywhere you go. And there's leaders that do that constantly. They go from echelon to echelon, do the same thing, can't communicate, and all the unit does is they bide their time. That's all. What else can you do? What does the old man really want? I don't know what he wants. What does this mean? Imprecise language, poor writing. It's a problem. And it's funny that we're talking about this, because it wasn't maybe a month ago. I had a former subordinate send me a resume, and it actually turned into a much longer discussion of not just what belongs in a resume, but how you communicate what you do to a civilian audience, because you're pushing out of the civilian world. So, you want a job, you want an entry level or a mid-level position somewhere, let's say at an accounting firm, and you're telling him, I used to manage 300 aircraft and a $10 billion budget. And they look at that and go, yeah, sorry, Chris, you were way overqualified for this job. Because they can't think in numbers like that. So what do you really do? On the same one, I got a kid who's a company grade officer saying, I'm a strategic leader in the Army. Yeah, no, not really, you're not. And you probably shouldn't say that, because to somebody who sees the 30-year-old kid on the other side of the table who says, I'm a strategic leader, they look at you and they think, oh, I don't need to be here then.
Yeah.
You just run the company, so you don't even need us. And they walk away. But it goes back to that inability to clearly communicate.
Mhm.
That that really strikes at the heart of who we are as leaders, and the need to be able to do that. Push your ideas out clearly, succinctly, directly. You ever watch the movie A River Runs Through It?
I haven't.
Okay, so it's an old Norman McLean movie. It had Tom Skerritt and I want to say Brad Pitt was in there. Um, but it takes place in Missoula, Montana, or around Missoula, Montana. And Brad Pitt, I swear it's Brad Pitt, it might not be, but
He's in a lot of movies.
he's a newspaper writer, or he will become a great newspaper writer and then a great author. And he is portraying the person who wrote A River Runs Through It, and Tom Skerritt is his father. And when Tom Skerritt homeschools the kid, every time the kid writes something, he just looks at it and says, write it again half as long, write it again half as long. Until the kid learns to just really write tight, concise, clear prose, and then it's okay. And I tell people the same thing. Hey, you hand me a 10-page paper, write it again half as long. Get those ideas, get the fluff out, get down to what's important, get down to the facts. We don't honestly, as leaders, spend enough time doing that. And,
yeah, and arguably, I think writing and continually writing could help you do that, particularly article writing, to where it has to be kind of short and succinct. I think Reagan made all of his cabinet and officials give him, like, if it was more than one page, he wouldn't do it. Like, they called it the Reagan paper. I can't remember exactly, but that was how he kind of did things. If you can't fit it in a piece of paper, and I kind of like that. There's all these, military's complex, right? You and me both know that. It's hard to get complex ideas chunked down into the everyday level of kind of the vernacular that a lot of people want it. So personally, I think writing and reading kind of helps people being able to, because you're right, being able to articulate your thoughts as a leader. You can be the smartest person in the room, but if you can't articulate your vision, it's hard to kind of get other people on the same page as you, and therefore the influence will not be there.
Absolutely.
One of the last questions I want to ask you is, when you were in command in the Army, what was your command philosophy, and how did you personally kind of develop leaders under you?
So it's again a great question. So I'm thinking about this. So this is one that I actually have written a couple of pieces on the people who shaped me as a young leader. And
Okay.
probably the person who influenced me the most was my first platoon sergeant, a guy named Wes Dennison. And he was my platoon sergeant. He was an E7, sergeant first class in the Army. And he and I would spend Saturdays watching, as he would say, watching goddamn flowers grow on PBS while we drank beer at his house. And he would impart NCO wisdom on me. And it was always these one-liners that stuck in my head. And the one, when it came to that really shaped my leadership philosophy, my command philosophy, was, if you take care of them, they'll take care of you. I mean, that was his way of the golden rule. Just take care of the soldiers and they'll take care of you. Take care of the airmen, they'll take care of you. Treat people right. And that really shaped how I approached everything. And I tried to stick to that. I mean, that was number one for years. You'd see my top 10 list on my command philosophy, and that's what it was. Take care of them, they'll take care of you. Treat people as they want to be treated. And over the years, that actually worked out really well for the most part. I mean, there's exceptions to every rule, including the golden rule. There's always people that, no matter how well you treat them, they're still going to be who they are. And they're who they are, and there's not much you can do about them. So I took that, and this is interesting because I never really thought about ever doing leader development type things, and I would have never, if you'd gone back 35 years ago when I commissioned and said, "Hey, this is what you're going to do one day," I would have laughed at you. No way, right? But the spark really hit when I was teaching ROTC. And getting back to the whole Missoula, Montana thing, I was teaching at the Grizzly Battalion for 2 years at the University of Montana. Great place to live. You know, you're in the middle of the mountains in western Montana, the
But it's
banks of the
beautiful
Clark
out
Fork
there.
River.
Yeah.
It's amazing out there. But you know, it was interesting because at first it was the simple things. You know, you got those young cadets and you're teaching them field craft, basic leadership, you know, that kind of stuff, a little bit of military history, but just kind of getting at the edges. But it really whetted my appetite.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love to be able to sit and like spend a day with a cadet who couldn't navigate from one end of a building to the other and teach him how to use a compass and a map and get around. And it was fun, and it was imparting knowledge. And so as the years passed, I really started to understand. I didn't appreciate it before then, but how people, and you hit it already, how people are starving for mentoring and development.
Mm-hmm.
Because for every person that you find who actually gets mentored, there's probably 10 who don't.
Oh, yeah.
And they don't want to raise their hand and say, I'm the guy that gets left out. But if you really look at the force writ large and what's required to mentor, there are just not enough mentors out there for everybody.
Mm-mm.
So what do? So that's where leader development and coaching come in. You can still do a lot. And so the Army spent a terrific amount of time and money on leader development. But what I never really saw until the last couple of years was really good templates for how to do leader development.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd say, hey, Chris, you should put together a leader development program for your unit. You'd nod and go,
yep.
Okay, what goes in there, right? And so what I tried to do was my focus became taking those kinds of things that happen day to day. And it could be something as simple as, you know, they happen in a staff meeting, they happen during physical training, maybe they happen on the flight line.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you take those little learning moments and then start to pull them together and weave them into something purposeful? And so in my post-retirement career, that's what we focused on, is that I take my students and say, okay, now we're going to take those little things and we're going to pull that thread through all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than just create a bunch of new events, take the events that already exist and contextualize them in a way that you can make them teaching moments. Mm-hmm. And then you can reflect on them and you can talk about them. And because that's how I grew up. You know, I didn't see a lot of formal leader development, but I grew. And I realized that those moments that I grew were moments when I was in the motor pool, learning how to lead people, or, you know, putting together some kind of product for a visitor, doing different things. Those were what helped me grow. Mm-hmm. And so if we could find a way to take those existing events, and then you can add some different things, a team building event here, maybe you read a book and talk about it as a group. There's other things you can add in, and then leader development doesn't become something that is overly time consuming or expensive. It's just, you're just taking advantage of existing events. And so my philosophy, getting back to your original question, that became my philosophy. How do you take those things like that mm-hmm. and then lump all the lessons into them? And that's where you bring together leader development, storytelling, and all the other different things that we do, and put them into a context where we can learn and grow and develop and become better leaders from that experience.
That summed it up really well. And I think obviously writing is one small piece to the puzzle. I just wanted to hit that because we obviously both enjoy writing, but leadership, it sounds such like a simple concept, but in practicality, it's so complex, or else there wouldn't be so many Army having to write doctrine on what leadership is, or the Air Force having doctrine on what leadership is. And in particular, we have a thing in the Air Force called the tongue and quill. I don't know if you ever heard of that, but it's 20 some odd chapters of how to effectively communicate, both verbally and writing. And it's just incredible. You can tell who puts in the time for it and also who doesn't. And also, I wanted to hit one more point on the writing, leaving a legacy. I think that kind of goes along with mentoring. Like, you know, when you're young, you seek a mentor, but as we get older, I'm going on 8 years now. It seems like yesterday I just graduated officer training school. And that's kind of another way to leave a legacy, is to kind of help the next generation out. And I was watching a movie yesterday, and it talks about children, but it says, children are the living messages that we send forth to a time that we will not see. And I was like, wow, that's like a pretty profound kind of deep statement. Yeah. I was like, well, what if you kind of put airmen are the living messages that we will send forth to a time that we will not see. And it's true, because we're all eventually going to retire. So I was just like, wow, that's a pretty profound statement. And along with writing, obviously storytelling and everything like that too, with mentoring, will kind of, I think all of those things, kind of, as you said, put a thread through all of them, will kind of help tie all those together at the end. So
Yeah.
With all that being said, my very last question, because I know you're a Clauswitz fan, and I know this one was kind of scripted, but how does one approach his writings? I downloaded the audiobook. I got like 3 minutes into it. I was like, this is...
Yeah, it's a tough read. And I joke, it's a tough enough read that I'll joke that you have to read it in the original Klingon to appreciate it. Most people don't get that, some do. But I tell you, Clauswitz, and I've read it probably 3 or 4 times, unfortunately. So I look at it like this. So this is not a really long discussion, but in college, in my freshman year, I took this elective. It was a religious studies class called The Gospel of Matthew. And I'm a Catholic kid. Oh yeah, this looks like something easy. I'll take it, knock it out for an A. Thinking, how much time can you spend on one book in the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
We spent 16 freaking weeks peeling the onion back. And it's like the priest who taught the class, he was bringing in history books so he could set the context for the time, and this is what was going on, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, it was one of the most in-depth intellectual classes I ever took. And you didn't just like read the book of Matthew and it's like, well, I think this was going on. No, he'd be like, okay, what does this mean in this statement? And what, this is a metaphor, so how does this metaphor apply? And so you completely turned Matthew upside down, which gave you a completely different perspective on what it actually meant. Well, I think you have to do the same thing with Clauswitz. You can't just read it. And let's be honest, most people don't read it, they just quote it. You got to dig into it. You got to set the context. You have to turn the thing upside down and inside out. And then when you're finished, in my mind, you have to extrapolate the ideas that he wrote into contemporary terms, because he was very much struggling with the language of complexity theory, but not knowing what the hell it was. And so the language isn't there. So he writes very metaphorically. So you've got to extrapolate that into contemporary terms, and then it makes sense. Well, what happens, and this is where the biblical reference, I think, really comes into play, is you have Clausewitzian literalists who are like biblical literalists who think, okay, Chris, I'm going to poke your eye out. We're going to for the eye and not think, so Clausewitz says this, and that's what he meant. It's only that. No, and I think I got into an argument with somebody about center of gravity stuff. And it's like, well, Clausewitz, there's one center of gravity. And I'm like, well, that's because in Clausewitz's time,
there was one center of gravity.
It really was one center of gravity. There really was only one. That didn't mean that there wouldn't be more than one, or there wouldn't be a complex center of gravity, or he couldn't envision globalization in 1831.
Oh yeah.
And so he writes weird, and it's hard reading, and you have to take the time to sit down and peel back the onion on it. And I think, just like I had to take that class, it took a semester, you could probably take a good year and do nothing but peel Clausewitz apart, book by book by book. What did he mean? What was the context? What, where would that apply today? How would that apply today? But nobody wants to go to that level of work. I've only met one person in my life who actually did that, and it's Tony Echeverria, who is a professor at the Army War College. And Tony, I swear Tony probably does seances where he recalls the ghost of Clauswitz, and they have great conversations. And I hope that Tony eventually hears this, because he'll probably laugh like you are right now. But looking at Tony's body of work on Clauswitz, that's the only thing that explains it. He's either got the dead body in his house somewhere and it talks to him, or there's seances going on. But he's the only person I've ever met who works that hard to get inside Clauswitz's head. And that's what we really need to do. If you really want to understand it, you got to get inside of his head. And he's dead, so it's not going to be easy.
I love your analogy of the Bible, because when you read the Bible, it's like, what are they trying to, but you have to know context, and it kind of makes sense now about the whole context. And I brought that up kind of half-heartedly because I know you have a mug about Clauswitz, and I just see a lot of people quoting him. And
oh yeah,
I got 3 minutes, like I said, into the audiobook, and I was like, it's a little bit much.
Yeah, I hear you.
Well, anyway, Steve, I really appreciate your time, and hopefully we can do this again at some point. And I appreciate all your leadership, particularly in your blogs and in your writing. So thanks so much.
Awesome.